Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live on a magical Friday where I have made John giggle without saying a single word. It is. It just keeps getting better and better around here. We are excited to be back in studio to give you another action-packed, fun-filled episode filled with tax policy and whatever else happens to be on our mind. So anyway, in here in studio today with ITR Foundation President Chris Ingstad and ITR's Policy Director John Hendrickson. Did I get the title? I keep mixing up the titles.
I think that's right.
That's right.
John's
That's
actually
right.
on the foundation side of things.
All right. So anyway, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Start off with a little something different that we were talking about early on, but who is your favorite Iowan? And I'm not going to go to Chris first. John, I think I know what yours is, but your all-time favorite Iowan?
The chief, Herbert Hoover.
Well, see, we didn't even need to go there. It's tough, and I still haven't decided myself. And it's who can you claim as an Iowan, right? I mean, you've got historically, there's, can we claim Ronald Reagan? Can we claim John Wayne, Johnny Carson? I mean, there's
Reagan was just passing through, and while he definitely would claim his time in Iowa, I don't know that we've ever really laid claim to him as an Iowan. Now, on the other side of that, there's guys like Johnny Carson and John Wayne who were both legitimately born in Iowa and spent some small part of their early lives here before moving on. Johnny Carson to Nebraska and John Wayne to the West Coast.
Yeah. I think the obvious answer, which I really want to get into more in depth on maybe in future episodes of this, but is Niall Kinnock. And I think we've talked a lot about that, the documentary released recently about his life and who he was. And we think of him as a Hawkeye great, but there was a whole lot more to him. So I guess I'll go with Niall Kinnock for today.
Yeah, my choice would actually be in sort of a similar vein, and that's Bob Feller. Frankly, and the funny part is, those guys were actually like American Legion baseball teammates.
Yeah.
Growing up, and one becomes the best college football player on the planet. In fact, was I think the male athlete of the year, even beat out like Joe DiMaggio.
Yeah.
Talking about Niall Kinnock, of course, and Bob Feller's one of the all-time greats as a pitcher. What makes both of those guys, what makes their legacies that much richer is they both volunteered for service. I think Kinnock went in before the war started, even saw the clouds on the horizon, and I also believe Bob Feller was like the first professional athlete to enlist. He enlisted in the Navy on like December 8th, 1941. In fact, nice. I think famously was driving across Iowa or back to Iowa or back to Cleveland from Iowa when reports of it of the bombing broke out and signed, and
kind of a Pat Tillman kind of a story.
He really was, and he actually saw combat. He was a gun captain on, I think the USS Alabama, but on a battleship. And Bob Feller saw real legitimate conflict and was in harm's way. And Niall Kinnock, of course, flying an airplane with 1930s technology took a lot of guts too. And unfortunately, we all know the tragic ending to that story. But
yeah, well, good.
Can I share one more favorite?
Do I have a choice?
No.
Okay.
My second favorite would be Ding Darling, the Des Moines Register cartoonist.
Okay.
He was a national political cartoonist and was a contemporary of Herbert Hoover.
So he wrote a lot of clever cartoons that were complimentary of Hoover?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And he was a great cartoonist. So.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I've heard the name before, and it's probably been from you, but that's good. Our resident historian always has a little bit extra to offer. So
I felt good about some of the Kinnock and Feller details, and John just trumps that. But
yeah,
there we go.
Okay, good. A couple of things in the news that came out this week I just want to touch on real quick, guys. The first off is Governor Reynolds joined a lawsuit with a handful of other governors challenging the Biden administration's plan for student loan forgiveness. And I know we've talked about that. I think that we're going to find out a little bit more about how popular that is. I wanted to make sure that folks understood that we're going to have the next iteration of the ITR Foundation poll coming up, and that's actually going to be one of the questions that we ask is how do folks feel about President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan? But Chris, what are your thoughts on that lawsuit and how that might play out? Not necessarily from a legal standpoint, but more from a political policy standpoint.
I think the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of folks was based solely on whether they at the moment have student debt or not, right?
Right.
If you do have student debt remaining, you think great, right? And if you don't have student debt, either because you never took out debt, maybe you maybe you didn't go to college, maybe you used the GI Bill to pay for it, maybe you paid as you went, maybe you already paid it off, whatever. But for whatever reason, if you don't have student debt, at the moment, you're kind of angry, right? 'Cause you go, well, what about me? And why is that fair, right? And so understand how people think, but Chris, maybe you could take it from a little higher level, right? Not the reaction of the folks directly impacted, but what it means when President Biden tries to just discharge that student debt. I mean, isn't that another form of federal government overreach? Can he even do that, or is that kind of the basis of the lawsuit?
Well, I think that's right, and I haven't dug into the basis for the lawsuit, but there's really two reasons to be frustrated by this. Is the first that you point out is, why should I, as a taxpayer who doesn't have student loan debt, didn't take any out, or maybe I paid mine off, worked hard, why should I have to subsidize somebody else's because they have not yet paid theirs off? Well, that's really frustrating, right? I mean, I'm working hard, and now I got to work harder.
Had I known, we would have stretched out the payment schedule for 20 years instead of 10, and we could have cashed in ourselves.
That's right. But there's also that frankly should concern anyone, even if you support the concept of student loan forgiveness, is that this was a declaration by the administration to forgive debt at the expense of the federal budget and the federal taxpayers. Now, Congress has the power of the purse in this country, and those are acts of Congress. And there's been a dramatic slide over, I mean, John, you're the historian, over many decades in this country of the Congress ceding power and authority to the president in a manner that was far beyond what our founders envisioned and really threatens that separation of powers. But this is, I think, a significant lurch forward in that slide of letting the president and the administration just simply change, frankly, the law of it. So I'll be fascinated to follow the lawsuit. John, do you want to talk about that?
No, I think you're both right. I mean, you both made excellent points on this, and
that's what we like to hear,
and,
John.
That's keep that in mind for my next evaluation.
Okay, done.
But
podcast performance is also going to be on there, John. That's great.
But this is just another example of a long list of examples of I would say executive abuse, the growing power of the executive branch, the power of the presidency at the expense of the legislative branch. I mean, Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers of Congress. As you said, Congress has the power of the purse. The president unilaterally doing this should be a concern. And the other thing is that, let's just say, put down the constitutional questions of this, and let's just look at it from a strictly policy perspective. It does nothing to solve the problem in higher education, because colleges and universities are still going to raise tuition, and you're still going to have people coming out with various degrees with enormous amounts of debt. So it's not going to solve anything. And to a certain extent, $10,000 is a large amount of money, but for some of these debts, it's minimal when you look at some of the debt that students are actually coming out with. And that's a bigger question. And of course, one friend of our organization's, Dr. Richard Vedder, has done a lot of good work on higher ed reform, and certainly has brought up this point over and over again.
It's not only Congress has ceded too much power to the president, but isn't this also a case of I don't know if the states have ceded power to the federal government, but certainly the federal government has taken too much power, and it's up to the states once again to try to rein that in back to the principles or the parameters that our Constitution provides. I mean, isn't that what we're having to see? This is why 6 or 7 governors had to do this.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right, and I think that actually pivots well to the next thing that I wanted to touch on today, which was in the news, which was the Reynolds administration here in Iowa announced what our budget surplus is going to be for this year, which is on this fiscal year $1.9 billion.
To be clear, we mean the fiscal year that just closed.
The one that
June
just
30th.
closed, yes. I'm sorry. So we close the books after you tally up the score after the end of the fiscal year on June 30th, and this is where we're at, is that the state is collected far more in revenue than the budget. And a lot of that was anticipated. If you go back during the legislative session, we were expecting at least $1 billion in surplus, but it's actually $1.9 billion. And so the contrast again remains very clear of the federal government and all of their deficit spending and printing money and canceling obligations.
With interest rates going up, how do we think that's going to play out with all of our federal spending? John, you brought that up this morning in our pre-show planning meeting.
The pre-production meeting.
Right, yeah.
And so, I wanted to make sure that our listeners understood that these problems at the federal level are completely different here in Iowa, is that we have a balanced budget and we are generating budget surpluses. We're able to cut taxes and still not only sustain the state budget, but it continues to grow. And with all the caveats that hasn't completely factored in yet, and that there will be reductions in revenue, but we are ahead of the projections that were made when that tax bill was passed.
And we'll get the governor's report took it at a real high level and said we're going to have a $1.9 billion surplus. Right. LSA, I believe, will release kind of the more granular detail on Monday, and our foundation will report what we think the important things are there. So we'll see all the kind of line item detail there. But Chris, it's not just a surplus; it's a larger surplus than I think was predicted, or I think we will see, than was predicted even back in March.
Yes, right, dramatically.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. And so the other half of that, which was alluded to, was the state of the federal debt and where we've gone. And I know, John, you want to talk about that today, but it's the other half of that coin. You got a state that's doing it so well, like Iowa, but yet our federal government seems to be heading into the abyss almost.
It is, You look at not just what Iowa's doing, but look at obviously at the federal level, the budget process is broken, and it's clearly a spending problem because look at revenues. Federal revenues are soaring. They're still doing very well, and it's just they can't keep a lid on spending. But then just look at different states. You can look at, and we've talked numerous times on this program about, Iowa versus places like California, Illinois, New York that are in basically fiscal basket cases because, the point becomes very simple, but you cannot tax and spend your way to prosperity. And this morning there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that basically says that we are about to hit what they called, and I quote, the doom loop, because the national debt is getting so high that we're getting to the point where the interest payments alone is going to start interfering with the economy. So, for example, the gross interest expense on the national debt was $88 billion alone in August. I mean, those are figures that's probably hard for people to fathom. And then if you look at what this article argues is that they're saying that the current annual close to $760 billion annual net interest on the debt, you'll need an economic growth rate of 3% just in order to have a stable percentage where our economy is, $25 trillion, where that could service that debt. But the average growth they're forecasting for the remainder of 2022 and into 2023 is less than 1%, or in some cases negative growth if the economy continues, if this Biden recession continues. So this is a huge issue of the 31 trillion. No,
I mean, John, those numbers that you threw out, they are so big. I don't think those numbers in and of themselves mean anything to people.
No,
I
just know
they
they don't.
If I'm using the calculator on my phone, I've got to turn it sideways because I need more room to fit it. So, I think the takeaway there, John, is to even keep up with the debt or the interest payments, we need to grow at a certain rate, and we're projected to grow far less than that.
Yes.
So we might be in trouble.
Yeah.
And from a policy standpoint, I certainly have very little confidence in the federal government to fix how they budget, to fix this on their own. The solution will be more deficit spending, to print more money. And we've seen over the last couple of years and longer what that ends up as we're facing this kind of inflation. Are we not simply going to find ourselves in a situation where it gets even worse?
Well, I'm curious what happens when the federal, when our fiscal policy is basically, an inflationary, right?
Right.
More spending, but our monetary policy is trying to fight inflation, very hawkish, raising rates. Like, what do we do then?
Yeah.
What is the net effect of that?
Yeah. It's if you start reading financial news, more of the Wall Street kind of stuff, I mean, they're starting to factor in some really scary outcomes of where all this goes next year and beyond. And the other thing that we talked about at length in the pre-production meeting is, what does America look like for our children and our children's children? And at the rate we are going in this country, it may not look like it has for us. And that's scary.
Just think about it. I know people, including the person right across from me, who is waiting for a vehicle to come in because our supply chains are broken. This is unbelievable. Can you imagine what Henry Ford would say today? That dealerships cannot keep stock because we can't even produce the necessary components.
We're showing up with cash in hand, so to speak. We want to buy a vehicle, and they're like, "Sorry, we don't have any."
Yeah,
and that is literally the experience you have.
Yeah. And it's at in every sector of the economy, from things as basic as baby formula to new cars. To consumer staple items.
And this isn't a commercial, but I was in my favorite store, Fleet Farm, and there was signs up that said, "Sorry, due to supply chain issues that we don't have these products." And this is, I ordered 6 months ago, over 6 months, I ordered a new bookcase. It's still I still don't have it. They don't know when it's coming in.
Maybe you should have stopped ordering books over the last 6 months then. So, but you haven't adjusted.
The other thing that seems to not be interrupted is the supply chain for Herbert Hoover memorabilia. Right. It seems to me that continues to show up here at the office pretty regularly.
So there's a new Buchanan for President sign on top of the Hoover books this morning.
Well, good. Well, all right. Yeah, look, the solution to all of this, and look, it's going to involve real pain in our country. But we know what works. It's working in Iowa. It's free market. It's sound money. It's balanced budgets. It's not spending more than you collect. And it will require pain to get there, but that is the path forward for this country. If we want to return to the prosperity that we all enjoyed as we were growing up or starting our careers, or some of us are, can almost see over the horizon to the end of their careers, but if we want to have that prosperity for the future, it's returning to the principles that made America great, that made us strong, which are the things that we continue to advocate for. So it's not complicated.
I mean, from that standpoint, isn't the governor's sort of new campaign ad about living in Iowa and glad you're here? Aren't you glad you live in Iowa?
Yeah.
Isn't she kind of hitting the nail on the head with that?
Absolutely. That's a good point.
Yeah, it comes back to something that I'm not afraid to be a broken record on. I am incredibly thankful to be an Iowan, and we are blessed that Kim Reynolds is our governor, and we have a legislature that has given us this sound financial footing and understands what works best for Iowans. So that's all I had on my mind, gentlemen. We covered a lot of ground.
You thought you weren't sure where we were going to go with this.
I know. Well, we've hit our time limit. We're into overtime. So I wanted to thank you all for your hard work this morning in pre-production and appearing here on the podcast and bearing with me. This is actually our first videoed podcast. So hopefully we can manage to package this together. The audio production taxes my technical abilities, and adding the video is at a level of complexity that I'm still skeptical, even though I'm announcing this, that we may not pull off, but we're going to try. So anyway, with that, we'll sign off, and we thank you for being a part of this. Give us a 5-star review, a good rating, and we will see you next time.